Welcome to Ruth Ch.3, which I've entitled The Request, a Journey from Hopefulness to Readiness. Now, there are three key aspects to this particular part of the story, so we'll look at each of them in a separate session, but all of them are part of Naomi's plan. And it's a plan which begins as, first of all, what I've called a developing plan. Let's read verses 1 to 4 of chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet. He will tell you what to do." The chapter begins with those words, one day. But we know that one day can't have been too long after what we've just read in chapter 2, because chapter 2 ended with the townsfolk harvesting the barley. And here in chapter 3, we've got them winnowing what they've harvested. So let me just explain a little bit about the agricultural process there. It began with harvesting, with people going through the fields with a hand sickle, cutting down the wheat or the barley, gathering it and putting it on to nearby carts to be taken away for the next stage, which was threshing. Here at the threshing stage, the harvested crop would be scattered on a threshing floor, a hardened circular area where either the crops were then beaten with sticks, or cattle were allowed to trample over the stalks, or what was called a threshing sledge, a board with sharp spikes of stone on the other side, would be dragged across it, and the purpose was to separate the grain from the husks. Then could follow the third stage, the winnowing. The farmer came along with his pitchfork and tossed the grain up into the air, and what happened was that the lighter husks would get blown away by the wind. Threshing floors were very often in high places in the villages for the wind, the breeze to catch them. So the husks would be blown away, the heavier grain would fall to the ground, ready to be gathered and to be bagged. So in other words, not too long has passed between the end of chapter 2, the harvesting, and the beginning of chapter 3, the threshing. And the chapter begins by reminding us why Naomi needs a plan. Quite simply, she had a problem. Let's remind ourselves of what it is. Verse 1 tells us that she needs to find a way of providing a home for Ruth. In fact, the Hebrew word there for home really means rest. She needs to find a place of rest for her. To put it into our modern language today, an expression something like, "I need to see you settled, dear," would translate it perfectly. And any parent who's had growing up children will understand that desire to see their kids well settled. There's a problem. But now the problem gives way to a proposal. Naomi starts to see that Boaz, who just happens to have appeared on the scene and who's already shown them such kindness in letting Ruth glean in his fields, might actually be the solution to their problem after all. Funny, isn't it, how often in life the solution lies right under our nose and we don't spot it. After all, Naomi reflects, that man, verse 2, is a relative of ours. And the Hebrew word there, relative, is the same word that we've already seen in chapter 2 for guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer. So the cogs in her mind are suddenly, slowly starting to whir a little. And I love what follows. In verse 3, she says to Ruth, wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Wash didn't mean just the normal washing. They were referring to sort of the more lavish, lengthy washing you would do with perfumed waters and so on. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes. In other words, do yourself up a bit, dear. Interesting, isn't it? We do have to play our part in God helping to find us the right person for our life. Now, here's the interesting thing. All three of those things were things that were not done traditionally during a Jewish period of mourning. The lavish washing with perfumes, the putting on of perfume, the getting dressed in your best clothes. You didn't do that in a period of mourning. But it looks as if Ruth has been clinging on to her period of mourning for far too long. And here is Naomi saying to her now, Ruth, that really is enough. It's gone on for long enough. It's time to start looking to the future. It's time you decided to move on in life. You know, that's still true for us today. Sometimes we can get stuck in life, stuck in our grief over what might have been lost, over what might have been and wasn't. And that loss doesn't have to be a loved one like it was in Ruth's case, losing her husband. It can be the loss of an opportunity, an opening, the loss of finances or situations. And let's face it, many of us will have faced losses during this coronavirus period. But sometimes we just need to draw a line and say, enough. I've mourned enough. It's time to draw a line and start looking for what God has got for me in the future. Now, that was the first part of the proposal. Get yourself tidied up, dear. The second part of her proposal continues in verse 3. Wash, put on perfume, get dressed in your best clothes, then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Go and see Boaz at the threshing floor. Why at the threshing floor? Well, because when the farmers had finished the task of threshing that we spoke about earlier, what they often did then was to sleep with the gathered grain at the threshing floor overnight so that no one came along and stole it. And there would often be like a communal party as all the different farmers in the town or the village did that together. And after a hard day's work doing all of that, that party was often quite a good and relaxing time, and hence the reference to eating and drinking in the story. So Naomi is suggesting that Ruth goes down to see Boaz when he's had a nice meal, when he's had a nice glass of wine, when he's feeling pretty chilled and relaxed about life, because he's quite likely to be in a receptive frame of mind at that point. She's a shrewd old bird, isn't she, Naomi? But there's a third and culminating part to Naomi's proposal. For not only does she tell her to go down to the threshing floor, she says, I want you to go down to the threshing floor, but note carefully where he goes to lie down to go to bed. And while he's there in bed, go and uncover his feet and lie down. Now, what Naomi is suggesting there is nothing less than Ruth making a proposal of marriage. Now, why go to such tortuous lengths? Well, first, because for a single young woman like that, or a widow in her case, to go and make the marriage proposal, to initiate it in those days would have been very unseemly, very improper, very pushing herself forward. Bit of a hussy, really, doing something like that. But there's something more. Because secondly, it looks like there was quite an age gap between Ruth and Boaz. Because if you look ahead now to verse 10, which we'll read in a moment, what Boaz says there is, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor, the younger men. So that immediately suggests that Boaz didn't come among the younger men. He was in an older age category, quite possibly in the same age category as Naomi herself. So he would have thought that a marriage to a pretty young thing like Ruth would never have been on the cards for him. So Naomi realizes that Boaz might need a bit of a nudge to make the right call here. So what can we learn from this part of chapter 3? Well, yes, we can trust God to bring the right thing and the right people along at the right time. But sometimes it also involves a little bit of godly initiative from our side. And not just waiting for things to drop out of heaven while we pray. And then getting disappointed when they don't. So here's a question for you. Is there some godly initiative that God would have you take at the moment? Not to manipulate, but just to nudge things along a little. Maybe to open up some opportunities and to see if God is in it. Because when we do, some surprising things can happen, as we'll see in the next session.